99% of people watching crypto content are looking at the wrong signal completely. They're looking at price, they're looking at whether something pumped last week, whether it's trending, whether some influencer posted a chart with an arrow on it. And that's exactly why 99% of people missed Stellar before it became what it became. Because the signal that actually mattered was never the price. It was something structural sitting quietly underneath the price that almost nobody bothered to check. So today, we're doing the thing nobody's actually asking. Not which of these three will pump, the real question. Which of these three has the structural signal that actually matters? The one that separated Stellar from every other coin that looked similar back when nobody was paying attention. Flare, XDC, Quant. Three assets that get lumped together constantly in this exact kind of comparison, and almost none of the content comparing them is asking the right question. Let's fix that. Here's the thing. Nobody's asking, stated plainly, it's not which one has the most hype. It's not which one has the best chart. The question that actually mattered with Stellar before anyone was paying attention was this. Which asset has genuine, verifiable, institutional touchpoints that exist independent of retail sentiment? Not partnerships announced for a headline, not a name drop in a press release designed to pump a chart for a week. Actual, ongoing, structural relationships with the kind of institutions that don't attach their name to something unless there's a real operational reason to. That was true of Stellar's early payment rail work long before the broader market noticed. And that's exactly the lens we need to run all three of these through, one at a time. Honestly, without picking a favorite before we'd actually looked at the evidence. Let's start with Flare. Because Flare's story is the most straightforward of the three, and straightforward isn't always good news. Flare's entire pitch is interoperability, the FTSO system, Oracle infrastructure, pulling reliable external data onto the chain so smart contracts can act on real-world information. Technically, that's a legitimate problem to solve. So structurally, here's what the data actually shows. This asset is down close to 90% from its all-time high, down over 70% in the past year alone. And when you go looking for the kind of institutional touch point that mattered for Stellar, a bank, a payments company, a regulator, an enterprise consortium, choosing this infrastructure for a specific operational reason, it's thin, genuinely thin. The builder community around Flare is real, and the technology addresses a real problem. But the thing nobody's asking is whether solving a real problem is the same as being chosen by the institutions that would need to adopt it at scale. Right now, the honest answer for Flare is no, not yet, maybe not ever, if the current trajectory holds. This is a coin defined by technical promise without institutional pull. And that's precisely the pattern that separates a coin people will look back on as the one that never quite arrived, from a coin people will look back on as the next Stellar. Push on this a little further because the absence of an institutional signal is itself information, and it's worth understanding why that absence exists rather than just noting it. Oracle and interoperability infrastructure occupies a strange position in this industry, right? Now, it's necessary. Almost every serious blockchain application eventually needs reliable external data or cross-chain communication in some form. But necessary and differentiated are not the same thing. And that distinction matters enormously when you're trying to figure out which asset gets chosen by a conservative institution over its competitors. There are multiple projects solving similar interoperability problems using different technical approaches, competing for the same category of adoption. When a category has several credible options and no single implementation has separated itself through a landmark institutional selection, that tells you the market for that specific service hasn't consolidated around a winner yet. Flare may eventually become that winner, but right now, the structural signal test comes back empty, and an honest video has to say that plainly, instead of dressing up the technology as proof the price will eventually catch up. Now, XDC, and this is where the picture changes, because XDC actually has a structural signal worth taking seriously, a real integration with Bridge, the stablecoin infrastructure owned by Stripe. That's not a logo on a slide deck. That's an operational payments company, one that processes transactions for a significant share of global e-commerce, choosing to route settlement infrastructure through this specific network. That is exactly the kind of institutional touchpoint that mattered in Stellar's early days. Not flashy, not retail-facing, but structurally significant, because it represents an actual engineering and risk decision made by a serious counterparty. Here's the honest complication, though, and it's the thing nobody wants to say out loud about XDC. The market cap is still under $600 million. The trading volume is thin enough that pricing data disagrees across major trackers. One platform says the price is 2 cents different from another, which tells you liquidity here hasn't caught up to the news. So the structural signal is genuinely there. The institutional touchpoint is real, but the market hasn't built the depth around it yet that let you say with confidence this is fully priced in or even partially recognized. That gap, real fundamental improvement, thin market recognition, is exactly the kind of gap that existed around Stellar in its early payment rail years, before the broader market caught up. Whether XDC follows that same path or stays stuck in. Obscurity depends entirely on whether that bridge integration turns into more integrations, or if it was a one-time story that doesn't compound. Think about what determines which of those two outcomes actually and happens, because it's not random, and it's not just luck. Stellar's early institutional credibility didn't come from a single deal getting announced and then the story going quiet for a year. It came from consistent, repeated engagement. Different institutions, different use cases spread across a sustained period of time, each one adding a little more weight to the thesis that this wasn't a fluke. That's the pattern that eventually breaks through retail indifference. A single headline, even a genuinely good one, doesn't do that on its own. So the actual test for XDC over the coming months isn't whether the bridge integration was real. It clearly was. The test is whether it gets followed by a second serious institutional engagement within a reasonable window. Because that's the difference between a coin building a track record and a coin that got lucky once and is now coasting on a story that stopped developing. Now, Quant. And this is where the one I think most people watching comparisons like this one are sleeping on. Because the news here is genuinely significant, and it hasn't fully worked its way through the wider conversation yet. Quant was selected to participate in the Bank of England's Synchronization Lab, testing atomic multi-bank treasury settlement using its Quant NFOF platform. I want to be precise about what this actually is. Thank you for watching. But here's the thing, nobody's asking about this story, and it's the part that actually matters. Being selected for a central bank's experimental infrastructure lab out of what was almost certainly a competitive application process is not nothing. It means Quant's technology, the ability to package multi-bank treasury operations into single atomic settlement bundles, eliminating the partial settlement risk that plagues sequential CHAPS transfers right now, was judged credible enough by actual central bank technologists to justify testing it inside their own simulated settlement environment. That's a different category of validation than a partnership press release. It's the kind of quiet, technical, unglamorous credibility that doesn't trend on social media, doesn't get clipped into a 15-second video, and is exactly the type of signal that got completely overlooked in Stellar's early cross-border payment years because it wasn't exciting enough to cover. Look at the actual problem Quant is being tested against, because the specificity of it matters more than the fact that a bank is involved at all. Large corporates and upper-tier small and mid-sized businesses routinely operate accounts across multiple domestic banks, and rebalancing liquidity between them today means executing separate high-value transfers, one at a time, hoping each one settles cleanly. When one leg fails or lags, treasury teams are left holding partial exposure, reconciling manually, managing risk that shouldn't exist in a modern financial system, but does because the underlying settlement infrastructure was never built to handle multiple simultaneous counterparties as a single atomic action. That is an expensive, tedious, real-world problem that corporate treasury departments deal with constantly, and it is exactly the unglamorous category of problem that institutional infrastructure gets built around quietly without ever needing a marketing campaign to justify its existence. That's precisely why this kind of signal gets missed. It doesn't have a consumer-facing story. Nobody watching this video is going to personally interact with atomic multi-bank treasury settlement, but the institutions that would interact with it, corporate treasurers, bank operations teams, central bank infrastructure planners, care about this exact problem enormously because solving it removes real operational risk and real cost from systems that currently run on decades-old sequential processing logic. When a technology gets chosen to be tested against that specific problem by one of the most conservative, risk-averse central banks on the planet, that's not proof of eventual success. But it's precisely the category of quiet, structural credibility that Stellar had years before the broader market noticed it existed. So here's where these three actually stand. Once you strip away the hype and look purely at institutional structural signal flare has a very interesting, technically interesting, structurally thin, no meaningful institutional touchpoint that resembles what Stellar had early on. XDC, a real wide operational integration with a major payments company, but sitting on a market that hasn't built the liquidity or attention to match it yet. Quant, an experimental but genuinely significant selection by one of the most conservative, risk-averse institutions in global finance. Testing infrastructure that solves a real, expensive, ongoing problem in wholesale banking. Here's the part of this comparison that nobody else is doing, and it's the actual answer to the question this video is built around. The reason Stellar's early institutional work went unnoticed for so long wasn't because the work wasn't real. It was because the work was boring. Cross-border payment rails, correspondent banking, friction, settlement risk. None of that trends, none of that gets a headline with a rocket emoji. It's the kind of unglamorous, structural, operational level problem solving that institutions actually care about, precisely because it doesn't need to be exciting to be valuable. It needs to work. And run that same test against Quant's Bank of England selection, and the pattern lines up almost perfectly. Multi-bank treasury rebalancing, partial settlement risk, intraday liquidity buffers, manual reconciliation. These are not retail-facing problems. Nobody outside of a corporate treasury department finds this subject matter interesting on its face, but that's exactly the kind of problem that, when solved credibly, gets adopted quietly, expands slowly, and eventually becomes infrastructure. Nobody questions because it's simply how things are done. That is the Stellar pattern, boring problem. Real institutional interest, slow, unglamorous validation that the broader market ignores until it's too late to get in at the early price. Compare that to Flare's positioning. Interoperability and Oracle data feeds are useful, but they're also increasingly treated as commodity infrastructure. Multiple projects solving similar problems, no single institutional-grade validation event that separates Flare's implementation from its competitors in the eyes of a conservative counterparty, like a central bank or major payments processor. The absence of that kind of validation isn't proof Flare will fail, but it is the honest answer to the question nobody's asking. And the honest answer is that Flare currently lacks the specific signal that mattered most in Stellar's early trajectory. XDC sits in an interesting middle position on this test. The bridge integration is real, operational, and structurally significant in exactly the way Stellar's early payment work was. But one integration is one data point, not a pattern. Yet Stellar's early credibility didn't come from a single partnership. It came from a sustained, multi-year pattern of quiet institutional engagement that compounded over time. XDC has the first data point. Whether it gets the second, third, and fourth is the actual open question that determines whether this becomes the next overlooked infrastructure story or stays a single good headline that never repeats. Let's talk about why this specific signal, quiet institutional selection over loud retail hype, is the thing worth tracking structurally going forward. Retail attention is reflexive. It responds to price, and price responds to retail attention, which creates a feedback loop that tells you almost nothing about the underlying asset's actual trajectory. Institutional engagement works on a completely different timeline. Banks, payment processors, and central banks do not make infrastructure decisions based on a green candle. They make them based on multi-month, sometimes multi-year evaluation processes, pilot programs, security audits, legal review. When one of those institutions publicly attaches its name to a piece of crypto infrastructure, even in an experimental capacity, it's not a good thing. That decision reflects a process that already happened quietly, out of public view, long before the announcement ever surfaced. That's precisely why this signal gets missed by 99% of people watching this space. It doesn't show up as a chart pattern. It shows up as a precedent, a press release most people scroll past because there's no dramatic price movement attached to it yet. Consider how differently these three assets would rank if you were doing this comparison using the metric most content creators actually use, pure recent price performance. Under that lens, all three would look roughly similar, beaten down, well off their highs, unloved by the broader market. That similarity is exactly why the comparison feels pointless to most people. And it's exactly why almost nobody bothers to look past it. But price performance measures how the market feels about an asset in the moment, not what's actually being built underneath it. Stellar, during its own quiet years, would have failed that same test down significantly from any local high, ignored by the mainstream conversation, dismissed as one of dozens of interchangeable altcoins with a payments narrative attached to it. The people who eventually did well holding it weren't the ones reading price charts. They were the ones tracking the slow accumulation of institutional relationships that didn't matter to the market yet, but eventually did. That's the actual filter this video is applying, and it's worth being explicit about why it's a better filter than the one almost everyone else uses. A coin's price tells you what the market currently believes. An institutional selection process tells you what a sophisticated, risk-averse counterparty has already independently concluded through due diligence the retail market hasn't seen and generally can't access. Those are fundamentally different types of information. And the second one is a leading indicator precisely because it moves before the price does, not after. This is why the thing nobody's asking matters more than the thing everybody's asking. Everybody's asking which of these three will pump next, and that question is unanswerable because pumps are driven by sentiment, and sentiment is close to impossible to forecast reliably. But the structural question, which of these three already has a sophisticated counterparty's due diligence working in its favor, is answerable right now, using information that's publicly available, and sitting there for anyone willing to look past the chart. Run this filter one more time, comprehensively, across all three assets side by side. Flare has real technology and an active builder community, but zero landmark institutional selection events of the type that mattered for Stellar. XDC has exactly one. The bridge integration, which is genuine and operationally significant, but remains an isolated data point rather than a pattern. Quant has an institutional selection from one of the most conservative counterparties imaginable, explicitly experimental, explicitly non-binding, but structurally the closest analog to what Stellar's early cross-border payment engagements looked like before anyone outside the project was paying attention. This is the actual answer to what this video promised you. Out of Flare, XDC, and Quant, the one carrying the structural signal most similar to Stellar's early institutional trajectory is Quant, not because the Bank of England lab guarantees anything, and not because Quant is risk-free, but because being selected by one of the most conservative financial institutions on the planet to test real settlement. Infrastructure is exactly the kind of quiet, unglamorous, boring on the surface validation that historically precedes the moment a market wakes up to an asset it ignored for years. XDC is the second most interesting structural story here, carrying a real institutional touchpoint that just hasn't compounded into a pattern yet. Flare, on the current evidence, is the one still waiting for its first genuine structural signal to show up at all. There's one more piece of this worth sitting with, because it's the part that determines whether any of this analysis actually holds up over time or just becomes another prediction that quietly gets forgotten. Structural signals like the ones we just walked through aren't guarantees. Quant's Bank of England lab could run its course over the coming months, produce useful findings, and then simply end without ever converting into anything resembling live adoption. That happens with experimental programs constantly at every institution in every industry. XDC's bridge integration could turn out to be exactly the isolated event some skeptics already assume it is, with no second or third institutional engagement ever following it. And Flare could, 6 months from now, land its own version of a landmark institutional selection event that completely resets where it sits in this comparison. Nothing about this analysis is a permanent verdict. It's a snapshot of which structural signal currently looks most like the early pattern that preceded a genuine breakout, based on the best verified information available as of the time of recording. That uncertainty is exactly why this filter matters more than a price prediction would, not less. A price prediction pretends to know something unknowable. A structural comparison like this one simply asks which asset currently has the kind of quiet, institutional, unglamorous validation that historically precedes the moment a market wakes up and lets you decide for yourself how much weight to put on that signal going forward. That's a fundamentally different exercise than guessing a number, and it's the only honest way to actually answer the question this video opened with. But here's the two-part answer this video actually owes you, because a direct answer without the second half is incomplete. The direct part is what I just gave you. Quant currently carries the strongest early stellar-shaped signal of the three. XDC is building to one, and Flare hasn't produced one yet. The second part is the part you need to sit with after this ends. Every single early institutional signal Stellar ever had looked exactly this uncertain, exactly this unglamorous, exactly this easy to dismiss as just a pilot or just a lab or just an experiment that might not go anywhere, right up until it wasn't uncertain anymore. And by the time it wasn't uncertain, the price had already moved past the point where getting in early actually mattered. So the question I'll leave you with is this: if the signal that mattered most for Stellar was never the price and was always the quiet institutional selection almost nobody was tracking at the time, which of these three are you watching for the right reason, and which one are you only watching because of what the chart did last week? Because those are two very different reasons to hold something, and only one of them would have actually gotten you into Stellar before anyone noticed it was there. This video is for educational and informational purposes only. Nothing here constitutes financial, legal, or investment advice, always do your own research and consult qualified professionals before making any financial decisions. If this changed which one of these three you're actually paying attention to, hit like on this one. It tells the algorithm to put structural comparisons like this in front of people who are done chasing charts and actually want to know which fundamentals are real. Subscribe if you want the follow-up the moment any of these three land their next institutional signal, because this comparison is a snapshot, not a final verdict, and it will need updating. Share this with the person who keeps asking you which of these three is about to pump, without ever asking why. They're asking the wrong question, and this is the right one. Drop a comment and tell me honestly. Do you think Quant's Bank of England lab actually turns into something live, or do you think it quietly ends the way most experimental pilots do? I want real arguments, not just predictions. 3 coins, 1 real filter. Go apply it yourself before the next one runs it for you. Have a great day. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, subscribe to the channel, and be sure to join my free Telegram community with the link on my channel where I post my daily crypto experience and arbitrage opportunities you can't get anywhere else. This is XRP Colbert signing off.